Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm Atina Jahan, and with me today is our expert, David.
Always great to be here.
Today we're diving into a really complex situation, the ongoing ethnic violence in Manipur, India, and the role of the country's Supreme Court. We'll be looking at an editorial and a news report, both from the Hindu.
Okay.
It's a crisis that's been going on for over 18 months, and the big question we're exploring is, can legal processes really bring a healing touch to a state that's so deeply divided?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's not just about Manipur. It really gets at the power and the limits of the law in addressing these really deep societal conflicts.
Exactly. So to kind of set the scene, we've got this unrest and violence that's been simmering for quite a while, and this editorial we're looking at is actually pretty critical of the Supreme Court. They're saying the court hasn't been proactive enough, especially this year in 2024.
Right, and they really zero in on this concept of writ jurisdiction, which is basically the Supreme Court's power to, step in and make sure everybody's following the rules. Think of it like the court having a big referee whistle. They're saying that the court hasn't blown that whistle loud enough this year when it comes to Manipur by not really holding enough hearings and taking a more active role.
And from what I was reading in the sources, it's not like things are, calm and peaceful over there. The sources describe a state that's essentially split in two, with different ethnic groups living in separate areas, and there's even mention of armed militant groups acting as like the de facto law enforcement in some places.
Wow.
And then there's this part that really got to me. It talks about a hateful ethnocultural oath that was administered to some legislators. It's just chilling.
Yeah, it's a really stark illustration of just how much distrust there is and the level of animosity that's built up over time. I think it's really important to remember that we're not just talking about random acts of violence here. There's a lot of history, a lot of social context that feeds into this conflict.
Right. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind as we delve deeper into this.
Yeah.
But, it's not like the Supreme Court's been totally silent on this issue, right? They did step in when that horrific video surfaced showing the assault on those two tribal women.
Absolutely. That case was just so shocking that it really captured global attention. And the Supreme Court took suo motu cognizance, which is a legal term, but basically it means they decided to take up the case on their own initiative.
So they were like, we don't need to wait for someone to file a complaint. This is so serious, we're stepping in.
Exactly. It's them saying, we see you and we're not going to stand by and let this happen.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. It shows that they're willing to act even when other parts of the government might be hesitant.
But even with that intervention, the editorial points out that there have been these frustrating delays. Charge sheets have been filed, but actual trials haven't even begun, even in the case of the women's assault. Isn't there a saying like, justice delayed is justice denied?
Yeah, you got it. And those delays, they really erode people's trust in the legal system, especially for the victims and their families who are, waiting for some kind of closure or some accountability.
It must feel like they're being let down by the very system that's supposed to protect them.
Absolutely.
So let's kind of break down the Supreme Court's initial response when this crisis really started to escalate. They formed a committee for relief and rehabilitation, and they also created these special investigation teams, or SITs, to look into the crimes.
Right. Those are pretty standard responses you see in these kinds of situations. The committee is kind of like a first aid team, providing immediate support to those who have been affected. And the SITs are like specialized detectives. They're going in trying to get to the bottom of what happened and bring those responsible to justice.
Okay, that sounds good in theory. But the news report we looked at paints a much grimmer picture. It says that charge sheets have only been filed in 6% of the cases that have been registered. And even more worrying is that a lot of the SIT officers have actually requested transfers back to their home states.
That's a big red flag. It suggests that those SITs might be facing some major roadblocks. Maybe they're getting pushback from local authorities. Maybe they're just feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. But whatever the reason, it points to a potential breakdown of the system that was supposed to be in place.
Like sending in firefighters to a blaze, only to find out their hoses have been cut.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really worrying sign.
So where do we go from here? It sounds like the situation is kind of spiraling.
Well, the editorial doesn't just criticize, it actually offers some potential solutions. They lay out 3 key actions that the Supreme Court could take to kind of regain control and provide a real path to justice.
Okay, so let's dive into those and see if they offer any hope in this really challenging situation.
Yeah.
Because what's the first step? What do they think the Supreme Court should do to start turning things around?
Well, the first thing they recommend is actually moving the trials. They say the trials of any cases that have been investigated by these SITs, they should be transferred out of Manipur.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, trying to hold a fair trial in that kind of environment,
Mm-hmm.
it seems almost impossible, doesn't it?
Right, you've got witnesses who might be too afraid to come forward. You've got the potential for evidence to be tampered with, and the whole process could just be so overshadowed by these existing tensions. Moving the trials to a more neutral location could really help ensure that things are fair?
It's like trying to have a trial in the middle of a riot. You need a calmer setting to really get to the truth.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the first action they propose. What about the second one?
The second thing they really emphasize is transparency. They say the SITs need to do a much better job of communicating with the victims' families,
Oh,
keeping them informed about how the investigation is going, the status of any trials, things like that.
that just seems so basic,
Yeah.
But I guess in a situation like this where things are so chaotic, communication can easily break down.
Absolutely. And for the families who are dealing with this unimaginable loss, just being kept in the loop, even if the news isn't always good, can at least give them some sense of control, some sense of accountability.
Yeah, it's like being left in the dark while someone else is making decisions that directly impact your life.
Right. It's about respecting their pain and acknowledging their right to know what's happening.
Absolutely. And then the last action the editorial calls for is something pretty big. They're talking about creating a high-powered commission.
Right. This is a pretty major proposal.
Yeah, it sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is. What they're suggesting is a bipartisan commission made up of really respected figures, people from both sides of the conflict.
Okay.
And the idea is for them to conduct a comprehensive review of the whole situation in Manipur.
So this is going beyond just the specific legal cases, right? This is about trying to address the root causes of the violence and finding a way to achieve some kind of lasting peace.
Exactly. It's not just about assigning blame. It's about understanding the historical grievances, looking at how the government and law enforcement may have failed, and ultimately coming up with recommendations for how to move forward and achieve some kind of reconciliation.
It's almost like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
That's a good analogy.
And this commission would report directly to the Supreme Court.
That's right. The idea is to give it the authority and legitimacy it needs, so its findings are taken seriously by the highest judicial authority in India.
It's a bold idea. I mean, it's definitely ambitious, but can something like that actually work? It just seems incredibly challenging given how deep the divisions run in Manipur.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. On the one hand, a commission like this could offer a fresh perspective, bringing in these respected figures from both sides. It could help build some bridges, maybe open up a dialogue. It might even open the door to some form of restorative justice where the focus is on healing and forgiveness.
Okay. But there's always a flip side, right? What are the potential downsides? What could go wrong?
Well, the biggest risk is that the commission just gets bogged down in all the political maneuvering, and it fails to actually deliver any tangible results. It could become a target for people who don't want to see peace, who don't want to see reconciliation.
Right. So it's a gamble. It's a high-stakes gamble. And it really underscores how complex this whole situation is. We're not just talking about a few isolated incidents of violence.
Yeah.
We're talking about these really deep-seated historical tensions, cultural differences,
Yeah.
political motivations. It's not something you can just fix with a quick legal solution.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Law enforcement legal proceedings, they're important, they're necessary, but they're really just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
You've got to address the underlying social and political dynamics, and that takes a much more nuanced and a much longer-term approach.
It makes you wonder about the limits of the law. Can a legal institution like the Supreme Court really heal a society that's been torn apart like this?
Right.
Or does genuine reconciliation require a different approach altogether? Yeah, it really makes you think, can the law truly heal those deep wounds, or does it just kind of paper over the cracks?
It's tough. It's a really complex issue, and I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. Legal processes are definitely essential. You need them for holding perpetrators accountable. You need them for establishing some sense of justice and for trying to deter future violence. But you're right, they can't just magically erase all that pain and trauma and mistrust that fuel these conflicts in the first place.
It's like trying to fix a broken bone with a bandage. You might stop the bleeding, but that underlying fracture, it needs more than just a quick fix.
Exactly. You've got to think about those underlying issues. And that's why it's so important to consider other approaches alongside those legal remedies, things like community dialogues where people can come together and air their grievances and try to rebuild trust, or mediation efforts led by, respected figures from both sides of the conflict. And of course, you absolutely need trauma healing programs to address those deep psychological scars that violence leaves behind.
It's about recognizing that the law, while crucial, it can only go so far. You need a more holistic approach that tackles those root causes, the social and economic inequalities, the historical grievances that have been festering for, sometimes generations.
Right. And that requires a real long-term commitment from everyone involved. The government, civil society organizations, community leaders, and just ordinary citizens. It's about creating a shared vision for the future, one where violence isn't seen as an acceptable way to deal with conflict.
It's a tall order. It sounds daunting, but I guess the alternative is just unthinkable, to just let these cycles of violence continue generation after generation.
Absolutely. We have to believe that there's a different path, a better path. A path where people from all different backgrounds can live together peacefully, where diversity is seen as a strength, not a weakness, and where justice prevails.
Well, this deep dive into the Manipur crisis has been a real eye-opener. It's a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of conflict and just how challenging it is to find a lasting peace.
It's a reminder that we can't just rely on the courts to solve these deeply rooted problems. We need a multi-pronged approach that involves dialogue and reconciliation and a real commitment to addressing those root causes.
Well said, David. And to all our listeners out there, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the situation in Manipur? What do you think are the most promising paths to peace and reconciliation?
Yeah, leave a comment below. We're always eager to hear your thoughts and keep this conversation going.
And that wraps up another deep dive. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share this episode with your friends, and hit that like button if you found this discussion insightful.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.